We're at the kever at Rabbi Shlomo ben Yechiel Luria, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, known as the Chochmos Shlomo, the Yam Shel Shlomo. The Yam Shel Shlomo was born in Brisk in Poland, which is now, today it's Russia, in 1510. He was Nifter, Yud Beis Kislev, 1573. Here at the kever, Even Mikir Tizak V'Tega Nechayim. The stone cries out from the wall, V'Tega Nechayim, and the downtrodden are wearied. Ki Nafal Abir Haroim, the chiefest of all the shepherds has fallen. V'Goyna Goinim, the greatest scholar of scholars. Poi Munach Abir Hu Abirim, Melech Al Kol Chachmei Hamoirim, Sinai V'Akar Harim. Here, Sinai refers to his wide knowledge of Torah, V'Akar Harim, and his penetrating analysis. The author of the Yam Shel Shlomo. Well, the Maharshal, as he's known, had prestigious lineage that traced all the way back to Rashi. He was related to many of the Rabbanim in his times. The Rama, Maram Padua, he studied under his father, Rav Yechiel, under his mother's father, Rav Yitzchak Kloiber, and he became the son-in-law of Rav Kalman Habirkasten. Now, Rav Kalman Habirkasten was a great Baal Moifes. If you look in the Sefer Shalmei Chagiga, you'll see that there was a blood libel that was actually created by the Yishmaelim. Normally, we know of it Christian blood libels. It was created by the Yishmaelim, and the entire Jewish community was in mortal danger. Well, Rav Kalman Kalman, the father of the Marshal, it was Shabbos, but in order to save the Jewish people, he used Kabbalah and he davened, and the child came back to life, and the child said, "The Arabs killed me." But how did he use this Kabbalah? He had to write certain Shemais. So when he was Nifter, he writes that when I die, you should stone my kever as a kapara that it had to be Mechalel Shabbos. But this is Rav Kalman Habirkistan, the father-in-law of the Yam Shel Shlomo. Now Rav Kalman Kalman was Rosh Yeshiva in Lvov and Oistra, and the Yam Shel Shlomo succeeded his father-in-law in Oistra, and was then a Rav in Rosh Yeshiva in Brisk, and then he became the Rosh Yeshiva in Lublin. What about the Rav? No. Rav Shalom Shachna's son, Rav Yisrael, was the Rav, and the Marshal was the Rosh Yeshiva. Now, some of the greatest Talmidei Chachamim of his era were his Talmidim: the Levush, the Sma, Reb Chaim ben Betzalel, the brother of the Maharal of Prague, and there is even a tradition that the Maharal himself was a student of the Yam Shel Shlomo. His Talmud Muvak was Rav Moshe Mas. Rav Moshe Mas, the Matei Moshe, who records the Minhagim of the Marshal. Now, the Yam Shel Shlomo was a trailblazer and unique in his halachic approach, and that is, he refused to just accept the psakim and the views of the old masters of the Rishonim. That's not how he operated. He would look at the Gemara, he would start from the Gemara and see which approach is the most reasonable. Just because someone earlier said an approach, that didn't automatically mean that was correct. He would not hesitate to argue on the Beis Yosef or even the Rambam. We mentioned Rav Shalom Shachna continued the system of Pilpul of Rabbi Yaakov Polak, while the Marshal vehemently disagreed with that system and opposed that system, and he preferred the plain meaning of the Talmudic discussions. Now, the Yam Shel Shlomo was especially interested in determining the correct text of the Gemara and the Rishonim. That was like the starting point for him. Not the logic of the Gemara, not the halach. What is the correct text of the Gemara? And he would often criticize his predecessors for working off inaccurate texts. In fact, he would criticize sometimes the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef said a halacha, but it wasn't based on an accurate text. He would mention that. So he set out to establish the correctness of the text. Now, the Marshal is in the back of the Gemara as well by the Marshal. Chochmos Shlomo. Chochmos Shlomo is the Marshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria. It's sometimes difficult to comprehend. First of all, many of the publishers truncated his comments and condensed them. Many of his amendations are already incorporated in our text in the Gemara, so sometimes it's hard to understand what is the Marshal in fact adding. But the Marshal did not approve of Rav Shalom Shachna's texts and notes on the correct Girsa in the Gemara. So the Marshal also wrote Shalos Tshuvos. He wrote Responsa. He wrote a super commentary on Rashi called Yerios Shlomo. He wrote a liturgical poem for Shabbos. He wrote a Perush on the poem. He wrote a Kabbalistic interpretation of Psalm 67 of Tehillim, Lamnatseach Beneginos Mizmar Shir Leikim Yichanenu, and he arranged it in the form of a menorah, and he wrote a whole commentary about the significance of this psalm. It's a psalm we say after many mitzvahs, especially Sfiras Ha'omer. Now, the Marshal had a very strong personality. So we mentioned he did not accept Rav Shalom Shachna's emendations of Shas. He did not agree with the system of Pilpul, but he was an exceptionally humble man. Writes the Chida, the Marshal had his own personal Moichiach, own personal Magid, who before he would go to Bezdin every day, this Magid would come and give him Musar and reprimand him and tell him his great Achrayas, and the Marshal would sit before him like a student that sits before his Rabbi. As strong of a personality as he was very complimentary of his younger kinsman and relative, the Ramah. However, his friendship with the Ramah did not deter him from criticizing the Ramah. He didn't agree with the fact that the Ramah studied philosophy, secular studies, and he did not like the fact that when the Ramah wrote Tshuvos, in the opinion of the Yam Shlomo, the Ramah did not use correct grammar. The Ramah defended himself by saying he's using accepted idioms despite the fact that it was not the proper grammar. However, in later years, the relationship of the Yam Shlomo and the Ramah became somewhat strained because the Ramah wrote a Sefer Toras Chatos, and in the Toras Chatos, the Ramah constantly, consistently, and strongly challenged and argued with the Yam Shlomo. The Yam Shlomo wrote back against the Ramah in his commentary to Chulin. Now this is very interesting. This is something I was not aware of. Chassam Sofer writes in his Haskama to the Sefer Tzayar Labinyan something wondrous about the Marshal. Says Chassam Sofer, the wisdom of Shlomo, the wisdom of the Marshal surpassed his predecessors. The earlier editions of Shas, including the Lublin edition, were Malaya, Kimshainim, V'Ta'iyos, were full of mistakes and thorns. And this Gaon painstakingly sifted and corrected and cleaned and cleansed the text of Shas, making it a usable document. However, human capacity is limited. So because he exerted so much effort to correct the right text of Shas, he added a small amount of Chidushim. It's enough, it was Dailoi that he corrected the Shas. The Marshal was able to come along then, and he had a completely clean Shas, like a Shulchan Aruch, and now he was able to dig into a perfected Shas. But you should know, says Chassam Sofer, there are a few Masechtas the Marshal was not able to correct. He didn't get to. Menachos and Bechayros. Now the Marshal comes, can't dig in, because it's not accessible. And the reason is, the Rebbeinu Shalom wanted to show the world that without the Marshal, we don't have a Shas. So he left over two Masechtas to show that while everyone's able to dig into the Masechtas the Marshal cleaned, the Masechtas the Marshal did not get to, even the Marshal was not able to penetrate to the same depth. Well, says the Chassam Sofer, something I was not aware of, that most of the times where the Marshal questions the Marshal, you can answer up very easily. That's what the Chassam Sofer writes. The Marshal did not agree with the Beis Yosef's formula. We know the sheet of the Beis Yosef was, you take the Rif, the Rosh, the Rambam, 2 out of 3. Now we should understand already that the Yam Shlomo was not pleased with that. What do you mean 2 out of 3? All 3 opinions are equal across the board in every scenario and you just magically take 2 out of 3? No, you need to weigh each halacha separately, weigh the weight and the value of each opinion in each particular case. You need to learn the Gemara yourself, see maybe in some cases the Rambam is more compelling and the Rif is more compelling. So the Yam